Get back, get back, get back to where you once belonged. Get back, JoJo. I have been waiting in anticipation to do this deep dive. I am so excited. I don't know if it's exactly a deep dive or if it's a general review of something that we will probably be talking about ad nauseum on the From Us channel, but that's just the way it is. It also is the very first day of our brand new partnership with riotstickers.com. Check out the awesome deal that we will be talking about later in this episode. In the description below, you can check that out. Also, you can see it here on the scrolly scroll, and you'll notice it right here. It says powered by riotstickers.com. So go check out riotstickers.com when you have a chance. But we got to talk about the Beatles. So we're going to do that. Let's launch right into it, guys. So I watched the first part of Get Back on Disney Plus. I have to say, I mean, this thing is monumental. It's just a ginormous tomb of a documentary. You know, initially we were told, oh, you're going to get 100 minutes. Okay, 100 minutes out of 50 something hours and 130 hours of audio. That's fine. We can deal with that. And then word comes down the pike, but it's Peter Jackson. You know what I mean? Then word comes down the pike, we're going to get 2 hours. Oh, 2 hours. That's great. I'm happy. That's 20 minutes more. Great. No issue there. Then all of a sudden it's said that we're going to get friggin' 6 hours. And it's more than 6 hours. It's even more, because it's my understanding that Peter Jackson was tinkering with this thing right up until November 25th, 2021, which was my birthday, by the way. It was Thanksgiving. It was my birthday. And this was the best birthday present I could ever receive. It's a gold mine of revelations, people. A gold mine. I just was in awe. So here's the thing. Let's just dive into it. I got notes here. We're gonna go over the notes. Here's the thing that really sort of boggles my mind. You know, first of all, I'm like super stoked that we get such an even longer running time than 6 hours. I mean, this thing is nearly 7.5, 8 hours long. I mean, it is friggin', it's a beast. You have to think that that's roughly about 18% of the footage that is incorporated. That is a much larger percentage than we were initially guaranteed. And the problem, there's only one problem, and it's not even really a problem as in much as it's like a sensory overload sort of situation. I find myself rewinding every 60 seconds to take in what is going on, because everything flies by so quickly. If you're not familiar with the Scouse, I'm mispronouncing that, the Liverpudlian accents, all the English accents. If you don't have subtitles turned on, I watch this stuff. You have to watch it with subtitles, because if you don't have subtitles, you're going to be lost in the ether. So I got subtitles turned on. I'm constantly rewinding. And also, there's something happens every 60 seconds, and it's like either a revelation or it's like something that you're just not expecting. Like, wait, what? And here's the thing. There's definitely two levels. I 100% do believe there is two levels to digesting this. There is the Beatles fanatic level, where you are just like every second is like a delicious 4-course meal that you are just ingesting. And then there's like, if you are just like a general Beatles fan, you know what I mean? Like, you're not a fanatic, or you're just like, the Beatles. Yeah, I want to know more about that. I want to know it. It may not have the same impact, but for me as a fanatic, I was just sensory overload. I can't I keep rewinding the thing, as I said, and I'm trying to. It's weird because there's so much to get through. There's 8.5 hours to get through, and yet I need to like pause and stop and like think about what is being said or what is being done, like all the time. And there's so many things. I just started writing on my phone. I was like, I just had to, because I wasn't going to remember it all. But so let's first, and this is a little bit of a repeat from previous episodes. Let's start right here. Okay. First of all, we are watching a documentary that's been edited. What does that mean? It means there's several different layers of filter that the truth being what actually happened. There's several layers that the truth has to make it through before it reaches our eyeballs, right? The first one is the Beatles are being filmed for this very specific project. So they're around cameras all the time back then, right? And they're not necessarily in the best moods with each other and whatnot, but they're going to already not be exactly acting or saying or feeling the way that they might be if a camera or a microphone wasn't recording them. That's the first filter of truth that we need to get through in order to understand what's going on. Then here's the second mesh layer is you have Peter Jackson sort of showing us heavily editing something. You know what I mean? Like he is taking this stuff and he is editing it in a way that has to appeal to a certain agenda, which I would say is the third filter. So you have first filter being recorded, second filter, Peter Jackson's editing, so he's cutting. And then the third filter is all the people that you have to appease with your edit. So Peter Jackson's edit politically has to pass Yoko Ono, has to pass Olivia Harrison, has to pass Ringo and Paul. And each one of them has their own sort of agenda. So that's like 3 filters that this thing has gone through before it's finally reaching us, the audience. And even then, even still, you are seeing so much. It doesn't matter what kind of spin that they want to put on this thing, because they're trying to spin it and they are spinning it hard. And honestly, everything that we said up until this point was bit conjecture. But even with those 3 filters, even with the heavy editing, even with all of it, it's as plain as day what is going on the camera, especially if you've read books about the Beatles, if you know the stories, if you understand the dynamics of this band, whether you were there in the room or from a historical standpoint. It is so plain to see the turmoil and the animosity and it's not something that we're reading into. It's like there. It is so there. It's there in the little ways, these little sort of microaggressive ways that it will occur when you're around polite company. You know what I mean? Like they're around a film crew. They're around, Michael Lindsay Hogg was the director, who also is kind of like pushing his own agenda as well. You know what I mean? So it's like it's so weird. And that's the thing about documentaries, that no documentary is going to be truthfully true. You just have to sort of take what they give you and apply it to the things that and, try and plug in from a historical standpoint, how it all makes sense, yada, yada, yada. You have 1,000 amateur Beatles historians out there with their own hot takes based on, interviews and footage and, understandings of who these guys were, So right off the bat, you see, so then here's the next thing. Sorry, I'm trying to be as methodical as possible when I go through this, because I know I'm just going to leave something out. I'm going to be really pissed if I do. So here's the next thing that we have to think about. Let's think about what the Beatles are trying to do and what sort of precedent has been set in the past, okay? What Jackson does really well is he absolutely paints a picture of everything that is happening in the moment. He paints a picture of the stakes, I should say. Like when we think about this period of time, we're not thinking about it as a pressure cooker. And what he establishes in this edit is a pressure cooker situation. Why is it a pressure cooker situation? Because Ringo, who is an actor, they're all actors in various different ways. I'd say John is a bit of an actor because he was in How I Won the War, even if it was kind of like a novelty. Ringo, it's funny, Ringo probably has done the most acting out of any of the Beatles. Like actually like a working sort of actor. He's in a bunch of films in the 70s, in the early 80s. Shiny Time Station, no, what is that? Thomas the Tank Engine. But Ringo has probably done the most acting. He has been cast, or he's agreed to do a film called The Magic Christian. And The Magic Christian is supposed to start production with, I think it's with that guy Dick Odell, not Dick Odell. What is it? Denny Odell. I know I'm butchering the name. This film is supposed to start production at the end of January. The Beatles have just come off the White Album in November. And while they're doing the White Album, this was a real revelation to me as well. While they're doing the White Album, they shoot a promotional clip for Hey Jude, which we all know. It's a very famous sort of little, it's a very famous piece of media. It was like, and essentially, it's my understanding that was the first time that the Beatles are performing for any kind of audience, whether it's like a paying live audience or a studio audience. It's the first time that they've performed in 2 years. They haven't done it in 2 years since, I believe the last time was, I don't know, because it wouldn't have been, they did do the broadcast thing for All You Need Is Love. I don't think that necessarily would count in the same way. It was the first time that they had done anything like that in a long time, and they loved doing it. They did it at Twickenham, which I also didn't know. They did the Hey Jude thing, and it was a very sort of free form. We're just going to perform for the camera, and they're performing with a lot of different people in the room. There's like just all these people, and they're all going, nah, 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 nah. You've seen it. Paul's on the piano. John and George are on guitars, and Ringo's on the drums, and they had a great time. So for whatever reason, or not for whatever reason, inspired, sort of just coming off of that experience in a positive way, the Beatles are like, yeah, let's get back out there. We're going to play live, or we're going to do a concert performance. There's all these different things being kicked around. I'm not getting it exactly right, and I don't want to waste time getting it exactly right, because it was like a myriad of things. There was all these. They were going to perform. They were going to do like a residency at a like a ballroom in London or something in December. There were all these different things. And then, we're going to shoot the concert. And then, we're going to actually do brand new songs. It's like the thing kept changing along the way until January rolls around. January 2nd. That's when they come to Twickenham Studios, which is an unfamiliar environment. Okay. It's a very, very unfamiliar environment for the Beatles. The Beatles are used to they become introverts, right? They've sort of retreated from the spotlight in the public sense, and they spend all their time as a recording band in Abbey Road, right? Or in the new Apple offices on Savile Row. Is that how I say that? I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. Savile Row, something like that. That's where they spend all the time and doing their things. But they're not like being the Beatles publicly the way that they maybe were when they were a touring entity, right? So now it's like they want to go. They're like, let's dive back into that, right? And they're trying to figure out what it's going to be. They decide, hey, let's do, before Ringo has to, for whatever reason, they set this deadline on themselves, because this is really where the pressure and the problem of everything comes from. The fact that they have to get all of this done. They have to put this show on and come up with 14 brand new songs before Ringo starts shooting. Why would anybody, let alone the Beatles, decide to do this to themselves? There's a few reasons behind that, especially when it comes to, say, the Beatles. So they're not really sure what the thing is going to be. They kind of have some idea. They know there's going to be performance. They know that they get this documentary crew in there to start shooting them as they're rehearsing and refining and writing and arranging this material. And, we even up to the point where, like the second day or the first day, George Harrison is like, whoa, like they're filming us? Like what, even the dialogue bits? Like they're not even really, I mean, it's just all fly by the seat of their pants. And they're just going to try and once again, bottle lightning. Cause that's what the Beatles used to doing for the last 7 years. They've bottled lightning. And they've seen astounding success in the bottling of the lightning. It's never been an issue before. They just get out there and they bottle the lightning, and everybody loves whatever it is that they're going to do. The precedent before this for just sort of winging it and coming out on the other end, whether it was received positively or not, because it wasn't received very well. It was actually probably the first of the Beatles, the first time the Beatles were not received with critical acclaim, was Magical Mystery Tour. Brian Epstein dies. Probably the most significant event in all of Beatledom. Like the thing that like the single most impactful thing to the rest of the Beatles trajectory or career, whatever you want to call it, or if you had to put like the top 5 moments in the Beatles history, it would be Brian Epstein dying in 1967. He had been with them for 5 years. He was old. He was died at 32. He was older than them, and he was like this. He was like this figure of authority in their lives. He knew how to handle each Beatle, and he knew how to sort of guide them from one thing to the next. So the Beatles were it was Brian who's going, hey, we need to do 2 albums a year, and we're going to do 4 singles. We're going to do 4 singles, 1 single per quarter, and those singles can't be on the LP. That's Brian coming up with that. That's not the Beatles. If the Beatles just shrug their shoulders and go, sure, we'll take care of it, we'll do it. And back then, it wasn't a problem because the Beatles just knew how to, Paul and John were so tight. They were so in each other's like pocket. And then speaking of being in the pocket, the band was so tight, which came from those weeks and weeks and weeks of playing together live in Germany, when they were just nothing, finding that chemistry, that second language, and sort of fusing it all together, into this thing where they could do it, and then having that spearheaded by Brian Epstein, right? But then Brian Epstein dies. And what do? They go and they make a film. And there's no script for the film. There's no script. There's no nothing. Paul is like, our manager is dead, and instead of like convalescing about it, we're just going to soldier on ahead. We just did Sgt. Pepper, which is the pinnacle of the Beatles. Some would say is the pinnacle of the Beatles, right? Like the pinnacle of everything, like the highest ascension that they could reach. And maybe others would say, and for me, I think that was like I think that was kind of like the zenith, and then everything after that, like they weren't necessarily breaking new ground after Sgt. Pepper. Like everything they do, the White Album, which is my personal favorite thing that the Beatles have ever done. Like I love that album so much. Like it's not like, it doesn't go higher than Sgt. Pepper in terms of like, whoa, we're doing this crazy sort of out of the box thing, in the sense that, and it's also kind of interesting. It's like, what do you do after an album cover like Sgt. Pepper, where that in and of itself could have its own documentary? You could make a documentary about the album cover of Sgt. Pepper, right? What do? You do the exact opposite of it. Just a blank nothing. The Beatles. They go from being as busy on the cover as they possibly could be, where someone could spend hours and hours and hours in the room just looking at all the different little pictures, to just having a blank slate. You know what I mean? The going from busy to minimalist, that kind of thing. David, we're going to get to all of that. We've got a lot to say about Yoko, 100%. And thank you for joining us, Carpet Beggar. Glad to have you here as well. Freaking. So the Beatles have just come off of Sgt. Pepper. They launched themselves into Magical Mystery Tour with no script, as I said, and it's just a film of them jumping on a bus, going around doing weird shit. And the Beatles have this attitude of like, we're the Beatles. We can do whatever we want. It's not going to be a problem. Everybody's going to love it. And the music is great. And, if you're a Beatles fan, of course, you're going to love Magical Mystery Tour. But I feel like that was the first time where like the general audience was sort of like, it was screened in black and white. There was it was a disaster. There were a lot of sort of disastrous things around it, in terms of just not being like a smashing success. And so the Let It Be, the Get Back project, this is all of this is just history repeating itself, as it did with Magical Mystery Tour. Brian Epstein dies. The Beatles don't have that leadership. There's a void. John is no longer like the figurehead leader of the band. Paul, who had always been behind John, kind of secretly pulling the strings, is basically taking the lads from one project to the next. Okay, we're going to do this. Now we're going to do this. Now we're going to do this. Trying to sort of keep them together. And everything that they do is essentially brilliant, except for, this Magical Mystery Tour album, which is kind of it was a flop. It was a bit of a flop. It was a misstep, you would say. And then they bounce right back with friggin' the White Album right after that. Technically, Magical Mystery Tour is not even an album. It's a double EP. The original output of it is a double EP, and then Capitol on whatever they switched it around and made it more of an album, right? So they're just sort of like not aimless, but there's no, then they're like, let's form a company. Yeah, we're going to form a company. That's a great way. We'll consolidate everything that we do under this company. And they're essentially managing themselves, right? So there's like this void in organization, and you see that coming into January, into Get Back. There is no friggin' plan, and they're sitting there like right out the gate. They're sitting there wondering, what are we even doing here? Are we actually, like, why are we doing this? Like, should we be doing this? Blah blah blah. Mind you, they've just released a double album with, what is it, 34 songs? And some of their greatest material. That was the thing that was amazing about the Beatles. All of this stuff happened in 7 years. What we think of, like, every time we think the difference between, like, say, like Hard Day's Night and the White Album, that it would be like a decade of stuff. And it's not. It's just a couple of years. They're just constantly changing and evolving and never resting on their laurels. They just go on to the next thing. So even when Magical Mystery Tour maybe doesn't reach the heights that, say, Sgt. Pepper does, because up until that point, that's what I meant by Sgt. Pepper being the zenith. Up until that point, the Beatles had been like ascending higher and higher to the next level, and then they reach this point where they really can't push any further, and so then it's just like kind of like going in a straight line. And of course, not wanting to do a repeat of Magical Mystery Tour, which in a way was kind of a attempted repeat of Sgt. Pepper. We're going to strip things down again. We're going to do, even though White Album is not stripped down, there's a lot of incredible, intricate stuff going on the White Album. But things are stripped down in the sense that you have Dear Prudence is just like John, essentially just John. It's very stripped down. You have Blackbird, you have Julia, you have I Will, you know what I mean? These are very sort of stripped down songs. And you think about everything that they're doing on Sgt. Pepper, everything that they're doing on Magical Mystery Tour, and it's just like so congested with things that we're trying to do. And it's ironic too, because they only had 4 tracks to do all of Sgt. Pepper, and now they have like 8 tracks or 16 tracks with the White Album. So they've doubled the amount of tracks, but now they're doing songs like Blackbird, which is Paul and acoustic guitar tapping his foot, which is great too. There is brilliance in minimalism, in simplicity, and the Beatles were great at exploring brilliance through minimalism and exploring brilliance through excess, and on both sides of that spectrum. So again, to flash forward, now they've come off the White Album, they've done all this stuff, man. Hey Jude is their biggest single ever. I think it sells there's a pre-order, or it pre-sells 3 million copies right off the bat or something, or maybe it pre-sells 1 million copies and then it winds up selling 3 million copies. Point is that even no matter what it was that they were doing, even if they had reached the zenith with like something like Sgt. Pepper, their sales were like still like insane. They're still selling tons and tons of albums. Every single seems to be bigger than the last. Some would argue that Hey Jude is probably the biggest Beatles single, right? Like, it's just huge. It's ginormous. And it's a long friggin' song. You're like going like, what? Why would you make that song so long? And it's just like, we're the Beatles. We could do that. And that's another piece of what I'm just very disorganizedly trying to tell you about. They're like, we're the Beatles. We've done the impossible. We have literally conquered the world. We have conquered pop culture. We are the point at the pyramid, just sort of like leading the way in all these realms, in like fashion and music and movies and all this sort of stuff. Like, what do you mean I can't have a single that's over 3 minutes long with Hey Jude? Of course we can, and it's gonna sell bigger than any of our other singles. And that's exactly what happened. Like, that's that kind of mentality. It's the same kind of mentality as Prince. Prince is like, I want a camel with a stack of pancakes on its hump, like riding a skateboard at 3:00 in the morning. And the organizer, the assistant's like, what do you mean, Prince? We can't, that's ridiculous. What a ridiculous request. And Prince is like, why? I'm Prince. I've done all this stuff. I've done literally the impossible. I've become Prince, and I'm this genius that is, incredibly successful. I don't see how anything is not possible. And I feel like the Beatles have that even further. Like the Beatles are the Beatles at this point. What do you mean we can't just, rehearse, write, record, rehearse, and perform 14 brand new songs after just coming off of doing 36 songs for a double album, something that was very, very seldom at that point. Only like Frank Zappa had done a double album. And yet here they are reconvening. And then here's the other part too. And Ringo talks about being grumpy. They've been grumpy for 18 months. That 18 months ago was when friggin' Brian Epstein had died, right? Like things had not been, there had been strains, and there had been strains during the White Album. Ringo left during the White Album. That was, people were leaving. People, before George left the band, Ringo had left the band. You know what I'm saying? Like the seams were coming apart. So you have that. So you basically have this, this powder keg pressure situation where Ringo's going away at the end of January. We're going to go into the studio with a bunch of cameras rolling, and we are going to write, record, or we're going to write, rehearse, and then perform / record a lot. And it's a brilliant idea. The notion of the first time that we ever perform these songs live, they will be recorded for said album. It's a genius concept. And it's one that they hadn't done yet. And it made perfect sense. They had kind of done it a little bit with All You Need Is Love, because All You Need Is Love was recorded live for the first global broadcast around the world, where like 1 billion people watched it. You know what I mean? So you have all of this stuff happening, and the Beatles basically suffer from a startling amount of hubris. That's ultimately what it comes down to. It's hubris. It's this notion of we can do anything and we'll get by. We work best with our back against the wall. John says that in the thing. And I'll say this, in terms of the review part, this documentary is unbelievable. It's so good. It's not without its criticism, but it is so fucking good. It's like, it really is an astounding monumental work from Peter Jackson. He should win all the Oscars in documentarydom. Like, he is a master documentary filmmaker. He goes from being a master indie filmmaker to a master blockbuster filmmaker to a master documentary filmmaker. And it's so true, I think, to what Beatles fans want. You know what I mean? Like, he really understands Beatle fans, and he puts in all of these things, all of these little, tasty nuggets that we all are going to love. So let's launch into these notes now. We've been talking for about a half hour, sort of setting the tone for what this is, and probably will continuously repeat myself. So I have my notes right here. So the first thing right off the bat. So here are all the factors that really sort of made the Get Back project fail, in my opinion. And mind you, Get Back and Let It Be are two separate things. Get Back is what they were trying to make, and Let It Be is what the material that was recorded in January of '69 winded up becoming almost a year later in early 1970, right? So the documentary Let It Be and the album Let It Be are sort of like the afterthought salvaging. It's a salvaging of something that was supposed to be much bigger and ended up being probably, I would say, the Beatles' greatest failure, right? The failure that also killed them, that destroyed them ultimately. And you get the sense after watching this footage, you absolutely get the sense that they are not going to come back from this. You can see it. You can see the writing is already on the wall. You know what I mean? To go back to the spin thing for a minute, they are trying so hard to spin this as like it wasn't so bad. It was a massacre, dude. It was a total massacre. Maybe I'm using really sensationalized words, or I'm over sensationalizing it. But my point is just simply, they're trying to make it sound like it was just them, the bunch of the boys going in and recording an album. And it wasn't. It was the boys like reaching a level of dysfunction that they were never going to come back from, that it shows them in their death throes. And it's sort of sad, but it also kind of brings like it brings a bit of catharsis, I think, as like, in terms of like answering a lot of sort of questions that we've all had as Beatles fans. And it also kind of like brings a little bit of closure. It brings closure to who they were as an entity. So here are the things that I wrote down, the factors that really set up Get Back to be a failure. Ready? Number one, Paul being the boss. We've heard, and this would only get worse. It would reach its zenith with Maxwell Silver Hammer when they're recording Abbey Road a month or two from now. So we're in January of 1969. Then whenever it is that they record Maxwell Silver Hammer, which would be between February and God, would that be February and May, maybe February and June, some point, whatever the date was. That was the final like nail in the coffin for the Beatles, man. They just all wanted to just wring Paul's neck from that one. But this is Paul being the boss. Why is Paul being the boss? Because he's trying to rally the troops. He's trying to be the band leader. What does the band leader mean? And I'm not talking about like the leader of the band, not the one that's calling all the shots, but he's the band leader in the sense that he's leading them musically. That's the band leader. So he's not trying to make all the decisions as like the leader of the band. He is trying to be like the way you have in an orchestra. You have a band leader who sort of leads the instruments, arranging things, that sort of situation. And Paul is trying to be that band leader. And the guys are kind of not having it. You have John completely receding back, breaking down. And this is where people want to blame David. I don't know if you're still here, but this is what here's where Yoko really comes into the picture. John drives a wedge between him and his bandmates using Yoko to do it. And Yoko is not necessarily a total succubus the way people make her out to be, but she is literally sitting there in the circle with them as they're trying to be creative. He is sort of self-sabotaging by straining the dynamic further. They're already in an unfamiliar area. They hate the acoustics in Twickenham studio. They don't like it. They talk about that. We hate the acoustics here. It's like a big open sort of space. They're Hare Krishnas. George has his Hare Krishna friends, and Paul even notes, he's like, that's kind of daft. Daft means like dumb or whatever, or like foolish. He's like, that's kind of daft to have them there, huh? That kind of thing. You have bad acoustics, as I said, and they don't have any new material. They've just exhausted themselves with the White Album. So they're not coming, when they came back from India after being with the Maharishi before they made the White Album, they had demoed tons and tons and tons of songs. They had a bunch of material in the pocket ready to be refined in the studio. They had none in this case. So here is Paul trying to sort of really just sort of drum everything up. You have Yoko there, and you see Paul is very tolerant of Yoko. It's George actually, and it's not to be seen in this documentary because, again, remember we talked about the filters of truth. You have Peter Jackson sort of having to negotiate Yoko Ono's final approval for this documentary. So of course it's not going to paint Yoko in her full light. And here's the thing too. Nobody is like good or bad. There's no good or bad. There's just complicated people. All of these people are complicated people. All of them have done nasty things. John Lennon done plenty of nasty things. Paul McCartney done plenty of nasty things. Yoko Ono most certainly has done some nasty things. But they're all just sort of like, they're all just complicated people. It's not like Paul is not a good guy. Yoko is not a bad guy. They're just people, man. They're just people in situations that react depending on the situation. John is at a point where he would much rather be collaborating and working with Yoko than he would be with them. Being there with them is boring now. It's not fun and exciting like it is when he's jumping in a bag with Yoko. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, it's like there is just such a there's such a clear message being sent with, hey, Yoko is, it happened on the White Album and it happened further here. I think by this time they're almost, at least Paul, maybe not George, Paul seems to have just accepted that Yoko has to be there, and the only way that he can continue on with John is if he embraces Yoko. So he's willing to make their relationship work no matter what kind of tension is between them by simply embracing Yoko. That's what I noticed here in this footage. George, and again, Peter Jackson sort of, Yoko had opinions about things, and she would let the Beatles know the opinions. I don't know if they're necessarily present here for the Let It Be or for the Get Back, but they most certainly happened during the White Album. They definitely happened during Abbey Road. They're really trying to really get the sense that Peter Jackson's trying to just show how Yoko Ono is a good guy here. That's the narrative that they're trying to shove down our throats, and it's not a true narrative, but it's also not a narrative that she is literally preventing them from getting work done, because as we can see in the footage, she's sitting there not saying nothing, and the Beatles are they're just disintegrating. They cannot seem to click in and do what needs to be done in order to draw from this material. So you have Paul being the boss. Why is Paul being the boss? Two reasons. One, they don't have Brian Epstein anymore, right? So here's Paul kind of trying to like be the backbone and the rallying point and the focal point to drive things forward. But they also are on this insanely tight deadline. And it's just, you feel it looming. They use this calendar. They're counting down the days. And when you look at it visually on the calendar and you see how close their final day is to shoot this concert with brand new songs for the entire world that's watching, you kind of are like biting your nails. You're like, holy shit, how are they going to do this? Because they have nothing done. They just don't have anything done. So then you also have George asserting himself as a songwriter and just like a writing presence. I have always felt that George probably does not get enough credit for Lennon and McCartney compositions. Even though they are the authors of the work, it's a shame to me that George's input is just almost criminally like low, especially when you see how Paul uses Mal Evans. That's their roadie. Mal had been with them since 1962, along with Neil Aspinall, who worked on the Apple side of things. Mal was still in this roadie sort of role with them every second of every day. And then Neil had sort of taken over he's doing all the operations at Apple. You know what I mean? But you see how Paul is sort of using him as a backboard for lyric stuff for Long and Winding Road. You'd have to think that with George, it's about 100-fold. So here's George now trying to work it out. They're all just trying to work out songs, and that we'll see a little bit later leads to an infamous fight, the infamous scene of I'll play anything you want me to play, or I'll play nothing at all, that kind of thing. They haven't actually played live for a live audience in 3 years. So they went from literally playing all the time and having that sort of those chops honed and sharp to a situation where they're multi-tracking for the White Album, right? They're multi-tracking. So the multi-tracking has sort of crippled their ability to jam with chemistry. You know what I'm saying? They go in because they become a studio only band. That's oh, okay, now you do your bass part. Okay, they do some jamming. Your Blues is a jam. Helter Skelter is a jam. There are some songs they did Your Blues in a toilet. You know what I'm saying? And it has that feeling. You can feel the tightness of that jam, but it's they probably, how long did they rehearse that jam? With unhindered. And here's the thing: the Beatles were used to doing things in a very short period of time. If you look at any of the stuff that the Beatles did, it wasn't like they spent 3 to 4 weeks rehearsing it, but there was a sense of there was those musical motor skills, those, whatever you want to call it, that musicianship between them. There was trust and chemistry and energy between them that allowed them to just sort of execute with such precision. And that had gone all the way back to the days of Hamburg, where they are just doing 3 sets a day, right? They're doing 3 2-hour sets a day of just the same material, working that material, working out those chops, that those eye jet, like, hey, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. That means we have to end the song right here. That kind of thing. Whatever that musicians do, that secret language between musicians, they just hone it. They hone it and they hone it. And that's why when Brian Epstein says, hey, you have 2 weeks off, write A Hard Day's Night, it's no problem. Because that's all they do. That's all they do. All they do is play music together constantly. And now, in the last 3 years, you have to think that they hadn't really seen much of each other since October of '68. So they hadn't spent, that was a long couple of weeks. It's like, what, like 10, 11 weeks or something. They haven't seen each other. And now here they are in a room full of cameras trying to record, and they can't, or trying to, work these songs out. So I really think that the multi-tracking was a huge factor and definitely hurt their ability to jam with chemistry in a way where they could form songs as like a whole unit. Not just Paul going off into his world and writing like 10 songs off the top of his head, or John coming in with a composition or two, because that's the other thing that is sort of mentioned or alluded to here, is that by this time, Paul and John are no longer writing songs together. Yes, they're still a songwriting team, and yes, they still use each other's feedback to finish and complete those songs. But the days of sitting together in a room with 2 guitars and just polishing off a song, and I think Paul always said there was never a time where they didn't finish off a song, those days were gone, completely gone. Good afternoon, Amy. We're talking Beatles. Those days were gone. So then I said here, cameras are watching every move. They're on a tight deadline. They're in a foreign working environment. And I said, hubris rightfully earned in the past. In the past, those guys rightfully had earned this sense of we can do anything. As we said, we talked about the Prince thing. That is what is going to set them up for the biggest fail, the biggest fall. And then, I notice, so when Paul's trying to be the boss, when he's trying to be the band leader, and they're trying to make sense of all this material, George is kind of just noodling around on his guitar while Paul is trying to be the boss and be the arranger. And that's where the whole argument starts. Paul wants to be methodical while George wants to noodle. And George is like, well, we're never going to come up with stuff unless we just noodle around. And Paul's like, look, I want to be methodical about this because and at the end of the day, no one is right and no one is wrong. Paul is right because he's trying to think of the bigger picture and trying to get everybody, sort of rallying towards their common goal. And George is also right because George is like, we don't work that way, or it's not going to work that way for us. We need to just sort of feel it out until we get something. But the problem is they don't have time. So that's what ultimately leads to the first of many sort of passive aggressive arguments between the various different members. Paul and George are going back and forth, and Paul is just getting very micromanaging. He's saying, don't play your guitar while I'm trying to figure out my bass part, because we need to get one thing, concrete and ready to go before we move on to the next thing. And that's when George is like, I'll play this or I won't play this. I'll play whatever you want me to. And that's the one thing that people always dwell on the Let It Be documentary from 1970, but now we see the full context of what it is. And it's not like, it's not a big, nasty fight or anything, but you see the cracking of the seams, I wrote this: the problem is the show concept has put so much pressure, coupled with being so big and being so rusty, it crushed the Beatles. So having this big thing, because here's the thing, whatever they're going to do has to be great, and it has to be better than the last thing that they did, because the Beatles do two things. They're always great, and they always do better than whatever the last thing was. And now they're staring down this barrel of this thing that is just going to come crashing around them, because they're just too rusty. They can't seem to put this material together in a meaningful way. And they don't have much. John brings in Child of Nature, and he brings in Give Me Some Truth, which eventually would wind up on Imagine. It's a great song. You'll see a lot of songs that would end up on Abbey Road and end up on McCartney and end up on All Things Must Pass, all worked out here. So they're trying to figure stuff out. Nothing is working. They're not clicking. George, that's a little bit later. George does bring in, let me see where, as you mentioned, I Me Mine. He talks about I Me Mine at one point. So George brings in I Me Mine, which is one of his songs, and it gets, well, you know what? I see it a little bit further down. We'll talk about it in a second. They're just having serious problems, and finally, Paul just starts doing this riff. You literally watch, and that's the other thing that's just you're in awe of this, of what you're seeing. You are watching these songs that have been around for 50 years, these iconic songs that we all friggin' love, friggin' come together right before your very eyes. It's just, it's astounding. It's just unbelievable to watch and witness. And it starts with, you see Paul just sort of bum 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 bum, like he's trying so hard to come up with something. He's trying to pull songs. They're trying to pull songs out of thin air. And so Paul pulls Get Back out of thin air. He finds this thing in this bass riff that he just keeps doing over and over, because what he says is he has Ringo and he has George stop playing. He's like, you guys can't play. I just need to figure this out. And it's really weird to see and super awkward, but what I realized was, no matter what they say about Get Back, and, they say, Get Back eventually evolved into a protest song and stuff, but originally Get Back seems to be, without a doubt, a desperate cry to return to glory. It's almost like a death cry in a way. He just keeps saying it over and over and over again. He goes, get back, get back, get back to where you once belonged. He's talking about himself. He's talking about the Beatles. He's just playing this riff over and over and over again. Just it's almost a prayer. He's praying that the Beatles can get back to where they once belong, because they had just fallen out of such disarray. And that is what Get Back is born out of. And that's why it is so symbolic that these are the Get Back sessions, or that the project is called, that the documentary is called Get Back, and that it ultimately ends up being called Let It Be, because we can't get back, so we have to let it be. It's just so... It really is you can't make this shit up. It's just it's so poignant. But that was, my jaw was on the ground as I'm sitting there watching him try so hard to make this work. He's just going, get back, we got to get back. He's just talking to himself, so that happens, right? There's just such a genuine sense of there's such a lack of enthusiasm, and they just seem so uninspired. Ringo is dedicated at this point. Ringo had his moment where he got up and he walked out, and that was for the White Album. He didn't like the way he was being micromanaged by Paul once again on Back to the USSR or Dear Prudence. So he bounced, right? Now Ringo seems to just be in the pocket at all times. He's very quiet in the footage. He doesn't say much. And then when when they're not playing, he is you really see I saw Ringo's character in a way I'd never seen it before. You really see Ringo in this brand new light. You understand him so much more, and he's just, there's way more going on with Ringo than I thought. You kind of get this sense that that there's not much going on, in fact, and that he's a brilliant drummer, but whatever. And that's just so not the case, So Ringo is committed, and he's really in Paul's corner in that kind of way. It's George and John that are at wits with each other, and they're especially both kind of at wits with Paul. Now, here's the other thing too. People are going Well, it's not what we thought at all. Everybody's playing music together. They're so happy when they're playing music. There are all these lighthearted moments. That's the only thing that was left. What you're seeing are the last semblances of glue that are keeping the Beatles together, which is their musical relationship. So even though it's rusty, even though their chemistry has eroded from multi-tracking or whatever it might be, there's still that love for making music together. And you see that. Those are the smiles you were seeing. And people are like, "Oh, they're smiling." Yeah, but like they're like in the worst situation ever. Like they're in the worst situation ever. They escape it. They forget it for a moment when they're playing music and trying to create brilliant stuff in this pressure cooker scenario. I wrote here the death of the Beatles occurs at 70 minutes and 36 seconds. George says, and we end up doing something again that nobody really wants to do. Paul, that's what Paul does. Paul gets everybody to do something that nobody else really wants to do. It was Paul's idea to do Sgt. Pepper, even though they were kind of all on board. It was Paul's idea to do Sgt. Pepper. It was Paul's idea to do Magical Mystery Tour. Paul pushes the wagon as John becomes an acid casualty, as Brian Epstein dies, as he sort of grabs the reins in an attempt to keep them from steering off the road, that kind of thing. Paul says, if it turns into that, then it should definitely be the last for all of us. So George says, we end up doing something again that nobody really wants to do. And Paul says, if this turns into that, then it should definitely be the last of us, which to me is, that is at the core of everything. That is the disintegration of the Beatles. The Alan Klein Civil War, the Yoko stuff, all that stuff is there too. There's no one thing that makes the Beatles straight up break up. But if there is, it's that core. It's that little piece right there. George then says the Beatles have been in the doldrums for at least a year. And that could mean a myriad of things. That could be talking about Brian Epstein. It could be talking about the tension on the White Album. Remember, as I said previously, they recorded so many versions of Not Guilty. They did like 100-something takes of Not Guilty, and they end up putting on the White Album, they leave off Not Guilty and they put on Revolution number 9, which is a 9-minute avant-garde piece that easily could have been cut down to accommodate George's song. It's like they're trying to like keep him down, push him out as he's like sort of, exploding as a songwriter. George didn't want, and then George was reluctant or didn't want any of the songs on the show for fear of them turning out shitty. So George has just been stockpiling songs, and we know this because he releases the very first triple album in all of history called All Things Must Pass, his most brilliant work that he would put out. That's where George Harrison reaches his peak zenith, sadly, is in 1970. You could say that, well, you could say the same for John Lennon kind of too. And for Paul is just kind of just keeps going. He just keeps going and he keeps going and he keeps going. Then there's talk of the divorce, and who would have the children, which is just like sort of like something you say when you're getting divorced. Who's going to take all the children? In this case, I think it's Paul or it's John who says Dick James would have all the children. Dick James was the publisher who owned the Northern Songs catalog and was the majority stakeholder in Northern Songs, which means that he is the controlling interest and could decide to sell the whole catalog, which he did at that time and sent the Beatles into such a tizzy. And that's how the Beatles lost all of their songs. They lost all of their publishing because of that. That's when, you hear all the time about Michael Jackson outbid Paul for all the songs. He says, I'm going to buy your songs. And he does. Paul is still trying to get those songs back. Paul owns 23% and maybe John owns 24%. And then it's George and Ringo owning a combined 1.8%, 1.6%. So they each own 0.8% of northern songs, which, mind you, is bringing them plenty of income. I mean, they're definitely making good money, but they are making a fraction of what they might be making compared to Paul or John. I got my mind set on you. That was a cover that he did, Jeff's first cassette tape in '87. Actually, mine was the White Album and the Red Album in 1994. Those are my first two Beatles, and I have Alan Klein to thank for that Red Album because he was the one who packaged that together. I wrote this. In hindsight, they should have done. Oh no, well let's save the hindsight for after, because it's suddenly watching this. Suddenly, I'm going, oh my god, it's so blatantly obvious what they should have done in that pressure cooker situation. But we'll get to that in a minute. Lennon is so dismissive and condescending to George, who's trying to show them a song, and he's dicking around. It must have been embarrassing. So George comes in with a song called I Me Mine, which eventually would find its way onto the Let It Be album that would come out a year later, but they wouldn't record the song officially until January of 1970. So a year later, the song gets recorded for I Me Mine. Guess who's not there? John Lennon, because John Lennon quits the band in September of 1969. John Lennon quits the band. Any Beatles business, like any Beatles recording with John Lennon, I think ceases after 1969. In the very least, it ceases with the other three Beatles in August of 1969 when they track live I Want You, She's So Heavy. That's the last time the four Beatles are in the studio together as the Beatles tracking a Beatles song. That's it, August 1969. So they're months away from the final time they're all going to be in a room together. They're months away from John permanently quitting the band. And once John quits the band, it's George, Paul, and Ringo, the Threedles, that would reunite for the Beatles anthology project in the 90s. They're the ones that are tracking I Me Mine. Meanwhile, here is George working out the song with the guys, and John isn't taking it seriously at all. He's not taking it seriously. He's waltzing with Yoko. They're dancing around doing a waltz while they're trying to work out the song. Or when George is showing them the song, John is singing over George. So George is trying to show them the song, and John is singing over it, like just with complete disdain for George's songs for whatever reason. It is. And George, you could tell he's super hurt. He says, I don't care. This is a direct quote. I don't care if you don't want it. I don't give a fuck. It can go in the musical. Then later, and this is later after he's doing the waltz, they're doing the waltz, just like completely goofing on George. He says, do you dig it, man? Just so desperate for John Lennon's approval. Mind you, the reason why they record I Me Mine in January of 1970 is because Michael Lindsay Hogg has decided to include them rehearsing it in the Let It Be documentary film. Why? Because there's this moment of John and Yoko waltzing during I Me Mine. So it's John and Yoko's waltz that even gets I Me Mine onto the Let It Be album. How about that? I mean, it's just crazy. Really, really, really crazy when you think about all that. So you could see that George he's taken it from John, he's taken it from Paul separately. That's building us up for what's about to happen. We're going to get there. John responds very dismissively when he shows them I Me Mine. He says, George, have you any idea what we play? Rock and roll. He doesn't say rock and roll. He says, have you any idea what we play? Meaning, like, we don't play this waltz shit. We play rock and roll. Meanwhile, just before they had been doing Maxwell's Silver Hammer, because that's a Paul song. And Paul's songs take priority over everybody's songs. They would always experiment. They didn't give a crap about George's songs, or at least they would take George's songs seriously. But for every one George song, there's 10 Paul songs. And Paul's songs have to be done the best. And then the next to Paul's songs is John's songs, but those can be more experimental. You know what I mean? Amy, I can't. I can kind of imitate sometimes I can. It's like, this is Paul. David says, Sorry, guys. I've been really bad with the comments here. I'm trying to not get distracted. I wonder what John and George discussed after that. George was a guest on Imagine, and they did a track bashing Paul. That was How Do You Sleep, which was like one of the most scathing diss tracks, which was also in response to Paul's song Too Many People, which was aimed at John. That was on Ram, and they had George played slide guitar on that. But mind you, how many songs of George Harrison's post 1970 does John Lennon appear on? John was always happy to have George on his songs in the Beatles and out of the Beatles, but he never was around for George's songs, or very rarely was, or would do the most minimalist thing. So day 5 comes around. The days are counting down. Paul comes up to John and says, all right, Amy, I'm going to try and do it. John, have you have anything written? And Paul says, we're going to be in crisis, Paul, because John goes, when I'm up against the wall, Paul, you'll find that I'm at my best. That's so bad. Sorry, I'm trying. Well, David saying Paul wasn't even on George's When We Was Fab video almost 20 years later. That was done. That was kind of like a mini reunion after John had died. But that was because they were having, so Paul, that's a whole other bag of worms. In a super quick nutshell, Paul had been doing some very sort of behind the back stuff to George and Ringo. They had a bunch of beefs, man. He didn't show up for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in '88. Why do you think it was awesome? Amy likes my terrible Beatles impression. It's not good, Amy. Ringo talks like this. I wrote a song about an octopus, Ringo, I got rings on my fingers. Yeah, Ringo Ringo had great songs. He had Octopus's Garden. He had I Love Don't Pass Me By. Is a great song. And they reveal another song, something called Gone to Carolina. Blew my mind. That blew my freaking mind. David, Paul wasn't around because it wasn't around to spite George. It has that all they would play games with each other throughout the years. But basically, Paul, as I was saying, to get back on track. I'm sorry, guys, I'm getting back on track here. Paul asked John if he has written anything else on day 5, and John says no. Paul says we're going to be in crisis, and John says, well. When I'm up against the wall, Paul, you'll find that I'm at my best. But Lennon and Paul had been partners when they were up against a wall. Now they were separate writing entities, where with Paul always writing a ton more songs than John. Then what's crazy is the mic. So here's the other thing. We talked about how they're in this really uncomfortable situation with cameras filming them and microphones recording them, and it's just it makes everything even more tense, and you can tell they're not really 100% like fully being the way that they might be in that situation because they're being captured on film. They're holding back. They absolutely are holding back. So when people wonder why everything looks so friendly because they fucking have cameras on them. I mean, duh. It's so obvious, man. It's such a blatant whitewash job. But the mic comes to capture their tense convo, and they start screaming, not like screaming, but they like start like acknowledging the mic is trying to like be like a fly on the wall, and they're like purposely pointing out the mic because they feel uncomfortable with the mic there. And Paul says, Paul hopes that he can deliver. And John mentions that he has Sunday off and that he's hoping for a little rock and roller. But the well has gone dry for John. It really has. That's something that Richard Buskin always says, from Buskin with the Beatles. The well has run dry for John. And he's not going to get that little rock and roll. In fact, they bring in a record player to hear Across the Universe, because Across the Universe goes back. It did not happen right then and there. They're pulling out everything. Because here's the thing too. This is another thing that we need to acknowledge, or that we need to take a look at. They have gotten so advanced with what they're doing in the studio, because the Beatles pioneered all kinds of recording techniques that are still used to this day. I'm not going to go down that road, but there's like all this stuff that they used to do. At that point in time, it was very hard to recreate the songs that they were doing on those records. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, whatever they're going to perform live, because they're going to be recording, like the album will be comprised of the recordings from that performance. Whatever it is, it has to be something that they can do on the stage. It has to be two guitars, a bass, and a drum. They can't have no Mellotron action going on. You know what I'm saying? They're not going to have tape loops going on and on. They have to just do it. They have to do it with what they got. And they start going through their songbook, and this is a revelation. There are all these songs that, like, I guess they thought were lost to time, that Dick James comes down and brings them lyrics from their songbooks, because back then you couldn't just look up your you didn't just Google your song lyrics. You had to like have a songbook with the official lyrics written down. It was like a whole thing. There's businesses, publishers. I mean, that's what publishing sheet music was all about. You know, if you were in a band and you wanted to cover another band's songs, you had to go get the sheet music, you know, or you could try and play it by ear on the record. You go get the sheet music with the lyrics, and you just sort of try and put, you know, you put the song together. And so Dick James comes down at one point. We'll get there in a second. What I'm trying to say here is they're basically reaching back, because whatever that they do live has to be simple enough to be executed well live. And that's how we get One After 909. I had no idea, because I had known, everybody knows that One After 909 is a really old Beatles song. I mean, it's before they recorded any music. They had written, it was a very, very early song, probably going back to 60 or even 61, something like that, maybe 62, probably 61. And it's just one of the many, many Lennon-McCartney compositions. And there's a lot of lost Lennon and McCartney compositions from that time. Those dudes wrote a lot of friggin' songs together. I think officially it's 275, but I mean, even more that weren't recorded or given to other artists, you know? I mean, they just did so much. So One After 909 comes back out, gets dusted off almost 8 or 9 years after the fact, because they need material. They just don't have it. So they got Across the Universe. They got that. There's, wow, Ministry of Darkness with the friggin' wow. Okay, that's crazy. He's saying 1959 for One After 909. Thank you for that. David says, I wonder who was more spiteful, or why Paul really did wrong to avoid George like that. Captain got yeah. Another very interesting topic that I am going to not dive into, because it's going to deviate us from our path. 1959 is One After 909. So 10 years later, they're finally dusting off this song and recording it. You have Don't Let Me Down. I've Got a Feeling is coming out. Two of Us is coming out. They're formulating Get Back, Long and Winding Road, and Let It Be are all sort of accumulating. And then meanwhile, while these conversations are going on and Paul feels the camera on himself, you know, Yoko was always there. They're in this intense codependent relationship where he has fallen back. And, you know, there was a time, I'm not sure if it was during Let It Be or if it was during the White Album, there was a time where John would only speak to the other guys through Yoko. That's why when they say Yoko was the reason that the Beatles were broken up, and it's not. That's not the reason why the Beatles were broken up. But Yoko was a talking piece for John at a certain point. So John would only express himself through Yoko, which definitely sort of creates all kind of strain. And it's like perfectly it's such a Lennon-esque thing to do, to sort of just self-sabotage. Many years later, when, you know, Lennon started to get, you know, started doing all these interviews in the 70s and right before his death in Playboy in 1980, he just started talking about, like, looking back, you know, retrospectively, and having way more insight about that time than when he was in the middle of it, and recognizing that he had quit the band, or that he had wanted to quit the band, or that he was checked out of the band by 1966, that by Revolver. So even before Sgt. Pepper, he had been sort of checked out of the band, ready to leave the band. He had been, in a weird kind of way, going through the motions all those years. And now, during Let It Be, he's using heroin. He is in this crazy relationship with Yoko, who can never leave his side. He is just really going through the motions. He doesn't know how to tell the guys he wants to leave, but very clearly doesn't want to be there anymore. He doesn't want to work on George's songs. He's not bringing any new songs to the table, really. He's got Child of Nature, as we said. No, none of the stuff is clicking. And meanwhile, Paul is just boom, 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 boom. Here's another song. Here's another song. Here's another song. Paul is just going nuts with his songs. And yet, I'm sure this, for as hard as Paul worked, and Paul worked so hard, hardest working men in show business, right? Paul McCartney. For as hard as Paul worked, it almost seemed like John would effortlessly write something that was equally as iconic as Paul, even though Paul was putting in 1,000% more effort than John was. And that always kind of balanced them out. Paul is doing, positive show tunes, and John is writing like these brutal, raw, honest feelings from his soul. And then when you combine the two together, you get the yin and the yang of the Lennon-McCartney partnership, whether you need one without the other to have the Beatles. And you see that in their solo careers. John is missing the Paul in his solo output. Paul is missing the John in his. They are, and that's why they will never be as big as they could have been together as the Beatles, even though they were always big and larger than life after the Beatles. I wrote here, then there's a scene during all this tense going on. Ringo just starts messing around with a microphone, and he freaks out Paul with the feedback from the microphone, and Paul just explodes. But it's one of those things where like Paul plays it off. He's like smiling and he's trying to make it seem like it's a joke, but I did not feel like it was a joke at all. He was super annoyed. And it's not like he was annoyed at Ringo. It was more about, he was so like stressed about the situation. And then Ringo is doing this playful thing that Paul might normally be, because Paul is just as much of a kid as the rest of them, but he's trying to be the adult. He's trying to put on the adult pants, and the others are just sort of goofing around. And I would say Ringo to a much less point. In terms of who shows up, Paul is always the first one there. Ringo is always the first one there. George comes later, and John is the latest. John shows up super late. They're always doing stuff after John, and then John shows up and joins in. You know what I mean? This is when they talked about Hey Jude, and this was an attempt, Get Back is an attempt to bottle what they had done with the Hey Jude TV performance into not, hey, we did this for a song, now let's do it for an album. So we talked about that already earlier. People are confused, by the way, super confused. You know why people are confused? People are seeing the last remnants of the glue holding the Beatles together in front of the cameras. So people go, oh, everything is happy, everything is great, but like what you're seeing is literally the only thing that's keeping them from flying off the wheels, flying apart. Because every other semblance of these guys are just like they're not together. You see it so clearly. John says only 2 days to go, and then we have another 2 days off, referring to the weekend. George Martin then says you only have 15 more days or songs. He says you only have 15 more to go. So I'm not sure if he means 15 more days or 15 more songs. And then Lennon, and this is what Lennon was doing to George, and this is what Lennon was doing to Paul. Anytime Paul tried to like boss around John or whatever, he'd always go, okay, Paul, sure. Like completely like condescending and dismissing. Paul says it's a small LP with a large hole in the middle, with a picture of your behind. So he's insulting George Martin, who, by the way, does disappear at some point. George had walked off the White Album. Things had just gotten so bad. And it might have improved maybe a little bit with Let It Be, but he wouldn't come back as like a full-fledged producer. Glenn Johns co-produced Let It Be. He wouldn't come back as a full-fledged producer until Abbey Road. And then here's the other thing too. John in later interviews is always dismissing. He's always like, oh yeah, he like rolling his eyes dismissive of like, oh, which one was that? Was that on the Pepper album? Was that on the Revolver album? Like not like, pretending like he doesn't know what any of the stuff was, like this history. But the reality is those dudes were super aware of all that stuff. They were subscribed to Beatle Monthly. They were reading all the stuff, and you see a lot of newspapers lying around, and they do this whole thing with the basically, Pakistani immigrants, immigration. It was a huge sort of controversial issue going on in Britain, and you have all the right-wing conservative racist SOBs who want the Pakistanis out of Britain for whatever reason. And so they wrote a song. They tried to sort of formulate Get Back into a protest song against Enoch, this prime minister guy or whatever from England. And the lyrics were get back to the country you once belonged, talking about this guy was a Pakistani, this guy was a Puerto Rican in the USA, blah, blah, blah. It was the same thing in the USA, but with Puerto Rico instead of Pakistanis in Britain, that kind of thing. And what's interesting though is these guys are super aware, have a super sense of their accomplishments and what they did. So when John dismisses either songs or pretends like he doesn't really know what's what, he suddenly, you know how many TV appearances the Beatles did? I mean, just so many appearances. And then suddenly, John immediately knew that a certain stage setup was Around the Beatles. So Around the Beatles was a program that they had done, and they were trying to come up with a stage scaffolding for this concert, the Get Back concert that they're about to perform. And they're coming up with ideas, and they're showing sketches to Paul, and Paul says, "Hey, take it to John and Yoko. They're the artists." So they go over it. But what's fascinating is Paul recognized that it was from a program called Around the Beatles, and so did John, except John called it Around the Beatles 69. And it's just funny because for a guy who wants to pretend like he doesn't know like anything, or like just like trying to play it off, trying to be, too cool for school, he's very aware of that kind of thing. He was very aware of that. Looks like the set from Around the Beatles in 69, which I thought was a very profound, interesting sort of situation. And then, they're trying to figure out what the set is going to be, and John is just obsessed with talking about plastic. And you could tell he's dialing it in, man. He's phoning in. He's like, yeah, just make the set out of plastic, and it could have these big cubes of plastic. They have those polymers. Meanwhile, they're supposed to be like ready to do this show in like a week and a half or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Like, there's no time to figure out to research what kind of plastic you want to have on the set. Like, it's ridiculous. He talks in these crazy abstract terms as if they have time, and everybody kind of acts this way. It's like so incredibly disorganized, and you just get the sense that they are surfing on hubris, complete hubris, that they're just going to pull this off, and it's just going to be another notch in the Beatles' belt. You know what I mean? Michael Lindsay Hogg says this to Ringo, and I thought this was so telling, talking about the pressure, talking about the strain of trying to come up with material and have it ready in time. Michael Lindsay Hogg, who we always talk about, is the, whatchamacallit, Sam Haines' Let the Day Begin was a tribute to George Harrison's Here Comes the Sun. That is funny. Michael Lindsay Hogg, who it's funny, Orson Welles does come up in conversations like and Michael Lindsay Hogg talks about him. Michael Lindsay Hogg is the illegitimate son of Orson Welles, which is very interesting. So he says to Ringo, everything you do has got to be good because all your albums are good. There's not a Duff album. It's got to be the best. You have the hearts of millions with you. And then Ringo responds, every time we've done anything, it's always going to be the best. So, I mean, that's the attitude that they have going into something so disorganized. Even with Magical Mystery Tour, maybe the movie flopped, but the album had Strawberry Fields Forever. It has I Am the Walrus. Actually, Strawberry Fields was a single, but it got packaged together. You have I Am the Walrus, Baby You're a Rich Man, Your Mother Should Know. Like, these just classic songs. And, of course, all that stuff did really well. Fool on the Hill. You know what I'm saying? And that's when he also says that we've been grumpy for the last 18 months in response to Hogg saying that this might be their last TV performance, because he's sort of seeing Michael Lindsay Hogg is clearly seeing the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall is that the Beatles are probably, that this might be the disintegration of the Beatles. He can, like, I'm sure he can kind of tell. And he's trying to like he's trying to like coax this into something. And he's doing the best that he can in the situation. It's a weird situation, man, because it's like it's the Beatles. They're the real bosses, even though he's the director. So it kind of like, I'm sure it's not so dissimilar from what Peter Jackson was dealing with when he was working with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr on trying to put this out and trying to do something that would be honest and truthful for the Beatles fans, but also respectful of the legacy that Ringo and Paul are trying to leave behind. And that's what they're trying to do. That's what this whole whitewash campaign is about. Oh, it was actually a really friendly time because they know this is the end. We talked about this previously on our previous shows. They know this is the end. They know that they are securing their legacy, and therefore everything should be left on a positive note, which is why we didn't see all of this footage for 50 years. We didn't see the footage for 50 years because to them, it was nothing positive, you know? It was like this glaring elephant in the room. Now, what's interesting too is the Beatles were a complete democratic process. Ringo didn't want to go venture off to some exotic location to do the show. They had talked about all sorts of different places in England, places, you know, all sorts of exotic places. One place in particular that they wanted to do was this place called Sabratha, which was in Libya, I believe, right near Tripoli. And it's this beautiful Roman ruin amphitheater. And they wanted to have torches on the water. And they kept talking about 2,000 Arabs in the audience, like just this insane audience for the return of the Beatles, not only performing live, but performing songs that no one's ever heard and songs that were going to be recorded on their brand new LP that they were going to do live in front of an audience, which is an insane notion when you think about it. You're not a pressure. And then they're going to film it and then broadcast it around the world. You know, I mean, what you're seeing, the documentary that we have now, that's them. They were trying to make a documentary about the rehearsal process for this project. And that's how we get so much conversation and dialogue and talking about this, because the cameras were just flies on the wall. Nobody is being interviewed. There's no interviews happening. There's no talking head interviews. It's just capturing things as they happen. But to go back to the veto power, so the veto power in the Beatles was amazing. And Ringo, who was set to work on Magic Christian, doesn't want to travel for the show. And Hogg is trying to negotiate. Michael Lindsay Hogg is trying to negotiate a bigger show. And he's trying to get Ringo on board. He's trying to ply him with this shot of a helicopter from the sky. And that's going to be so great and so like excellent and good, blah, 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 blah. And Ringo's like, yeah, that's great for 2 minutes, but I can't travel all that way for 2 minutes. And they're talking about all these different ideas. You know, let's take an audience with us on the boat, and we'll sail down to the place. And George doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to be around what he considers to be commoners. And he's worried about the cost. How much is this going to cost? We still haven't paid off Magical Mystery Tour yet. You know, George was for as spiritual as George was, he was also very materialistic. He was, man, especially when it came to money and that kind of thing. But Ringo has all the veto power. The other three Beatles are not going to travel for the show because Ringo won't do it. And that's the way the Beatles worked. And it's kind of like an amazing system, considering the fact that John and Paul have the lion's share of the revenue via publishing, via music. The fact that Ringo would have so much veto power, that he, in his own way, despite all that stuff, that he is still very much like a pillar. It was 4 pillars of the temple that made up the Beatles, that kind of thing. And then it's mentioned. And Ringo finally sort of agrees. He's like, yeah, we'll do that. We'll do that. We'll go out to the amphitheater, whatever the freak. It's mentioned that Paul and John have not been getting along. Lennon seems like he's going through the motions. Yeah, Lennon just seems like he's on autopilot. When he's approving like the designs for like this plastic set, he's just like, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Like he just doesn't care. He just does not care. And you can see the strain. You see them trying, and it's only when they're making music that they kind of are getting along. And even though Paul says at one point, can you stop playing guitar? Because I'm trying to explain this arrangement stuff for you. Just stop playing for 5 seconds, you know? But what the best way to describe it is it's a freight train moving at full speed ahead, almost flying off the rails at any second. Like any penny on the tracks is going to just derail them, and they're just going to go flying and crash. You know, had they done the amphitheater in Sabratha, it might have lit a giant fire under them to pull from that place of greatness once again. So in a way, and this was part of like my, I should have organized this a little bit better in terms of like hindsight stuff. Had they decided to go to a foreign location, I think it would have gotten them in working order. I think the fact that they stayed put where they were didn't really give them the sense of urgency that they needed to pull from that place of greatness that they were so confident that they could pull from. Like they just thought they could just do it. You know what I mean? And I think that they needed something to really sort of light that fire, and they didn't have that. And having that location in Sabratha where they're going to perform in the amphitheater would have made that a reality. George says, shall we do some other people's songs as well? That'd be nice. John says, I don't know any. I can only just bear doing your lot's songs. And then George said some other people's songs are much better than ours. I mean, again, throwing full shade at George. George, John is basically alluding, I can't stand to do your songs. I don't want to do your songs, blah, blah, blah. George is on the right track, though. George has the right idea. They should have been performing, and that was going to be my first thing. Or that was going to be one of the things. Should I just do it now? We should just do it now. Let's do it right now. In hindsight, here's a couple of things in hindsight that could have saved the Beatles and could have saved this project. One, they absolutely should have done a cover set full of the rock and roll standards that they had done in their Hamburg days, and then maybe throw in 3 to 5 new compositions and record it all live. They would have had 14 songs. When you look at those albums, Beatles for Sale, when you look at, Beatles for Sale and With the Beatles, those two albums, half of the songs are covers. I think 8 songs are covers on Beatles for Sale. And it's definitely considered to be one of the lesser Beatle albums, probably the leastest Beatle album, right? Like it's one of the most obscure ones that nobody really talks about, Beatles for Sale. But the cover stuff is good. Same thing with, there are covers on With the Beatles. Please Please Me, I think, has a few covers, but not as many covers as With the Beatles and Beatles for Sale. And that's late 63 through early 60. Oh, and then late 64, because then they do Hard Day's Night and then they do Beatles for Sale, right? So Beatles for Sale, Hard Day's Night is the first time that every song is an original, like 100%. So the Beatles are no strangers to covers. The Beatles have that muscle memory of playing them. And at any time that they're not trying to rehearse brand new songs in this first part of the segment, they're gelling. They are gelling. Their musical chemistry is not lost, but their muscle memory for playing those covers that they used to play in the early days, it's still there, but they need to be able to, they're able to tap into that. And so what would have been smart is a lateral move of like, okay, guys, let's take Don't Let Me Down. Let's take Get Back. Let's take Two of Us. Let's take I Got a Feeling and Let It Be, or something like that. And then do the rest of them covers that we know, standards that we love, standards that we haven't performed on albums yet, or stuff that we only did for the BBC sessions. Problem solved. There is your biggest problem solved. That would have saved the project. What would have saved the Beatles? One, they should have cut George in on the songwriting fully. George was already contributing to John and Paul's songs. He was, in variety of different ways, whether it was from like little arrangement things to maybe even straight up guitar riffs or whatever the case may be. George had some kind of input in some way, shape, or form. And you see him trying to do it now here during the Get Back sessions, and they are just shutting him down, micromanaging him, trying to control exactly what he plays. They should have brought him into the fold. They should have said, you know what? From now on, it's no longer Lennon and McCartney. It needs to be Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison. Had they done that moving forward, suddenly the lion's share. And you know what they could have done? Instead of a 50-50 split, it could have been a 30-30-30. And then, hey, let's give Ringo 10. Let's give Ringo 10% of that split. And it's not for discussion right now, but the very last proposed Beatles album after Abbey Road, that's right, folks, there almost could have been another Beatles album, proposed 4 songs from John, 4 songs from Paul, 4 songs from George, and 2 songs from Ringo. And to keep that template forevermore, or to keep that template moving forward. But why not take the stake that they had in Northern songs, which would become a problem in and of itself later down the road, and just simply reorganize it, or at least shut the door on Northern songs with the Lennon and McCartney partnership and create something brand new in the same way that Harrison had Harris songs. You could create something brand new for all those dudes and just have Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison, Beatles songs, baby, Beatles songs. And then a lot of the strain might be alleviated, because no longer this dynamic, this hierarchy of it's Lennon and McCartney and then Harrison and then Starr. It now sort of folds in because Ringo doesn't mind. Ringo doesn't mind being Ringo. That's what he is. Ringo is Ringo, baby. He just does his thing. You know, he's happy with his place in the band. And it's said that he probably would have continued on with the Beatles. He was the only one who probably would have continued on with the Beatles from that point. He loved being in the Beatles in the same way that Paul loved being in the Beatles. Those 2 dudes didn't want the Beatles to end. It was really John and George more than anything that wanted the Beatles to end. I think those guys would have soldiered on. So they should have done those things. They should have cut in George and acknowledge him for what, you know, he is and what he's contributing. And they should have recognized that they weren't going to finish things out and just do some covers and a couple of originals. And they could have performed that show. They could have spent 3 to 4 days getting all that stuff together while they were putting on the concert. And then here's the final piece of it. George proposes that they do it at the Cavern Club, where things all started, where the Beatles really developed the beginning of their fan base in Liverpool. Go back just the way that they wanted to get back to where they once belonged. Go back to the beginning by going to the Cavern Club and come full circle and do the Get Back show in the Cavern Club with the packed audience full of old fans doing covers with a couple of new songs that totally fit in, because the songs, as we said, the songs are really sort of stripped down from where they were with Sgt. Pepper. You know what I mean? Everything's stripped down to be kind of like done live as like a live recording, you know, as they would kind of do on the rooftop. That would have saved the Beatles, I think, or at least maybe it wouldn't have saved the Beatles. Maybe they were fated to dissolve, but I think it would have breathed enough life into the Beatles that they wouldn't have ended when they did. That's the better way to put it. Moving on. John says in reaction to Bad Chemical Tea. John was like a real connoisseur of tea, and he's talking about like chemical tasting tea, I think, or maybe he's talking about hallucinogenic tea. Who knows? Maybe he's literally talking about chemical tea. He says it turns me off, blows my mind, and floats me upstream, which is also the first lyrics mostly of Tomorrow Never Knows. Turn off your mind, relax, and float upstream. Or is it float downstream? Maybe I'm wrong. Then they go into Susie Parker. I had Susie Parker, which was an outtake, and it blows my mind that they didn't use Susie Parker for this concert. They needed 14 songs. Susie Parker would have been one of them. It's so great. Susie Parker, yeah, Susie Parker, come on, Susie Parker. It would have been perfect, man. And they couldn't. They scrapped it for whatever reason. There was a bunch of stuff, man. There were all these compositions that were Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, Starkey, like all of them together, you know what I mean? Which also kind of blew my mind that I guess they had kind of arranged. Then Linda comes in, she's taking pictures, and you get the sense that Linda is almost there to balance out the Yoko. Now, I mean, obviously she was there, but I'm just saying from like a political standpoint. Obviously, Paul wants Linda in there, and whether you needed that for storytelling or not, like, or information, like giving to the audience, like to give information to the audience. Bottom line is you have these mostly dialogue bear things of Linda just taking pictures. It's a really cool touch, man. It shows like it shows her taking the picture, and it shows the still of the picture. But you just get the sense that that's in there to sort of balance Yoko, which is fine. But yeah, that you get that sense. Then Dick James comes in. Dick James comes in with the songbook. They're going through the songbook, the Northern songs. He owns the whole catalog, and it's not just Beatles songs. He owns more stuff, but he's the controlling stake owner. And what would happen because of remarks that Lennon was making in the press really sort of scared Dick James, and thought, man, Lennon once again is drawing too much controversy. I'm ready to cash out. He thought that it was time to cash out, and so he told the Beatles, like, hey, I'm selling this thing. And it's funny, right before this happens, he shows up here in the Get Back sessions. I was amazed to see him there, because literally right after that, at some point, he sells the catalog, and they're scrounging together to come up with the money to outbid whoever is trying to buy the Beatles publishing songs. But what's interesting is you hear Ringo says to George, would you like to see what you have half a percentage of? And George says, no, I don't. And, again, because it's kind of like, George was resentful. He even wrote a song called Only a Northern Song, which basically is like, it doesn't matter. Because here's the thing. The Beatles convinced George that his songs should go in with their songs as well, even though that he wasn't an equal stakeholder, because that it would have been better, that they would have all gotten more money if he was like consolidated in with them or whatever. And so George is writing songs, and Lennon and McCartney are making way more money off of George's songs than George's. But George is making more money than he would have if he had done separate publishing. Eventually, he did do separate publishing, and it was called Harris Songs. That was what Harris Songs was. And Ringo owned 0.8%, which he still owned. He never gave up his 0.8%. He still had that. And I'll tell you, I don't know if he still has it to this day, but man, you think about the millions and millions of dollars of steady, predictable revenue that has come in from that, that kind of thing. We're getting to the end here. So Paul and George argue. So then there's another argument that's very similar to the one we saw where where Paul was upset with George about, like, what to play or what not to play, like, when he's trying to like concentrate on his part. And they're just arguing over whether chords are fashionable. George thinks a chord is a chord and fits a song that calls for it. Comparing chords to drainies, pipe jeans. George then sort of flippantly says, you need Eric Clapton, and John responds, no, we need George Harrison. But it's interesting foreshadowing that it's first George who suggests you guys should get Eric Clapton, because he's just feeling so alienated. Paul is so micromanaging and bossy. We understand why he's being so micromanaging and bossy, but he's just trying to keep the show from flying off the rails. He's so trying to keep it all together. John becomes very passive aggressive and John has a passive aggressive anti-authoritarian streak, and it comes out like all the time in various different ways, this passive aggressive anti-authoritarian streak. And he, at one point, he's saying, let's use the lyrics involving the political stuff with the Pakistani and Puerto Rican immigrants for Get Back, which is just not commercially doesn't make any sense for obvious reasons. But that's just kind of like where John is. John, and it's true, John's focus is on all of the avant-garde stuff he's doing with Yoko. They put out 2 albums, man, of just like weird avant-garde sounds. and that's just what John is into. And that's when I said that John and Paul should have just cut in George and Ringo. In the very least, just to go back to that last part that I said, just to go back to that other thing, if you're not going to, here's the thing. If you're going to cut, let's say that they were going to split everything, because the bands that don't have any resentment towards money, like, let me rephrase that. When money isn't like a factor of conflict within bands, they prosper, they go on, they can move onward. It's like that was the thing with the Ramones. Even though certain guys are really only writing the songs in the band, they split. All the guys were necessary for the band, and therefore everything was split 25, 25, 25, and 25. And you would imagine maybe they would refuse to give Ringo 25%, but that's why I was thinking Ringo should get 10% of the publishing, and if not 10%, then why not 25? Why not just make everything equal? Everybody standing on this equal, like, sort of footing, they could have soldiered on. And then that's when, Paul wants John to stop playing while he's discussing the arrangement, as he's trying to show John what exactly to play. And John is just not having it. And then they completely skip over. Now here's where the first part ends. Brilliant place to end it. George quits the band. We've seen George trying to work with John and Paul. He's trying to give sort of feedback, or trying to say this or trying to say that, and they're just not having it. They're like, no, just be quiet, or here, play this part, and you'll play this part when we want you to play this part, and yada, 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 yada. And you see that George is he's checking out, man. He's just super checking out. They go to lunch, and something happens during that lunch, and they don't make mention of it in the documentary. And I have to look it up and see if I could find it. There's a fight. Supposedly there's a physical fight between George and John. You know what? When we do part 2 of this review for the second part, I'm going to dig that out. I'm going to dig out that passage from the book that I have upstairs. There's a fight. George says something really nasty about Yoko, and John responds by punching him in the face. And because she had been eating his digestive biscuits or something. And that's when he says, I'm quitting the band. I'll see you around the clubs. Peter Jackson is trying to instead put emphasis on the fact that John and Paul are just sort of shutting George out creatively, which I'm sure was a factor as well. But I think it's this explosive incident. And John says, without giving any reference to what it is, so I guess we're just going to pretend like nothing happened, just as George leaves, right? Okay, Minister of Darkness is saying that the fight was bullshit. You have to explain. Why? What about it? Yes, Joey says too. She did sit on his cushions, man. She was sitting on his cushions. It's true. I saw that part. I was like, holy shit. Why do you think the fight was bullshit, Minister of Darkness? I'm curious to know. We got a commenter saying that the fight was bullshit. The fight was not bullshit, man. That's what went down, right? What follows is complete bedlam. They start jamming, and the jam is crazy, and they're kind of having a good. It looks like they're having a good time for the cameras, but you can tell it's them just completely dissolving. Like any sort of organized effort by Paul McCartney to sort of drive this train into the station completely breaks down, and he goes back to being a child like the rest of them in that kind of way. They all are just bashing on their gear, doing feedback and jamming out and dancing and going crazy. And that's when Yoko gets the mic and she starts going, doing her Yoko thing. And the other thing that they cut out completely, okay, Minister of Darkness is saying that it's been confirmed many times. I'm going to find the passage, Minister of Darkness. I'm telling you, man, that fight happened. What they completely ignore is the Yoko wants a mic. If you don't know what Yoko wants a mic is, go Google it. This whole exchange happens where Yoko is incessantly asking for a microphone. And when she gets it, she's just going, John! John, and we see it in the thing, and he finally goes, what? It's very, very truncated. And I'll tell you one thing. When you look at it, when you actually look at it on the film, it doesn't look as benign as when you, like, I listened to it. I listened to the whole thing, just the audio, because we didn't have the video. And a lot of the audio that they show has been there for many, many years. I mean, this stuff was all heavily bootlegged. So hardcore Beatle fans know a lot about the events of what has occurred, but something that we've never seen is the video that goes with the audio. So when you see the video, it doesn't look as maybe like cringy as it sounds when you're just listening to the audio. But she's like, yeah, but it goes on and on and on. It goes on for a much longer time as they're trying to have a conversation about business stuff. Yoko is vying for attention, and it's the first time in almost 2.5 hours into this documentary that we see Yoko kind of like really taking center stage, apart from just sitting there reading a newspaper or knitting or, talking with Linda. And that kind of makes her, that's the stuff that makes her seem like a succubus to me a little bit. There's a whole scenario. And again, Google what happened. Yoko had a bed. They had a bed in the studio while they were recording Abbey Road because of Yoko. Yoko was injured, or maybe she was pregnant and injured, or maybe she was just pregnant, and they had a bed put in there in the studio while they were working. It's kind of crazy. But you think about it, like, that's what it took to get Abbey Road. It took moving a bed into the studio for Yoko Ono in order for us to have Abbey Road. So I guess that's a good trade-off. But and then you'll see George Martin come back to the picture. But they break down. They melt down. They don't know what to do with the rest of the day. It becomes, and that's what had been happening. They just spent so much time farting off, dicking off, just messing around with it, just no time. They're not taking it seriously. It's like they know they have to do it, or they're trying to do it, but they don't want to. And their actions speak so much louder than whatever words they're speaking. So then, of course, famously, John says, and this is a flippant, again, just totally being flippant and passive aggressive and condescending and ridiculous. He says, let's get Clapton. And I think the reason why they don't react, here's why none of them freak out when George leaves. They don't want to give him the power. They don't want to admit that George has the amount of leverage that he has in that moment. You know what I'm saying? And he has all the power. They are on this tight deadline. They need him. Like, you wouldn't believe they need him to do this thing, and he's walked out on them. They're not going to replace him with Clapton. I mean, what kind of crazy controversial thing would that be? I mean, just been absolutely insane, They just don't want to give George any power, and so they just pretend like it doesn't bother him. But it's deeply troubling. Deeply, deeply troubling. And then you have the scene where Neil Aspinall, who's, again, he's a guy, longtime Beatles confidant, roadie, just like Mal Evans, been there from the very beginning, who is now in this position of power at Apple, their company, and George Martin. They're trying to break down what's happened of, John and Paul versus George, and also acknowledge that John and Paul are writing separately now. So they were like analyzing the dynamics of the situation all the way as it was happening in real time, and then Paul says something, and this was really telling of what Paul feels inside. So no matter how politically correct or how sort of amicable Paul could be about any sort of situation, how he could just sort of let things roll off his back for the greater good. There's this moment where I guess John and Yoko, they're like, being extra, kissy public display of affection as John has left the band, like they're just dicking off or something, as George has left the band. George has left the band, not John. And he calls out and he says, "Get in your bag, get in your bloody bag." And then Yoko says, "Not again." And Paul says, "The Mercy Beat award for best couple of the year should go to John and Yoko." And he is so like, again, like he's being so sarcastic. There's such animosity under his words, even though it's trying to come off like a joke, like a you fucker, like that kind of thing, And And it concludes with, it ends with the Beatles heading over, ceasing everything to head over to George's house to convince him to come back into the band. And that meeting does not go well. And part of the reason why that meeting does not go well is because of what Yoko says. That's right. Yoko does a lot of talking, or does some talking in that meeting. It's Yoko, Linda, John, Paul, George, and Ringo at George's house. I mean, insane when you think about it. It's insane to think what if Yoko was like a reliable person that you could like actually like get like some very unbiased like opinions from, like, but you can't, because she's just she's on a, not only is she on a Lennon tilt, but she's also on a Yoko tilt. You'll never get like an honest appraisal. I mean, that's a problem with a lot of this stuff. That's a problem with, to an extent. That's why this footage is such a gold mine, because it's just presented to us as like a fly on the wall thing. We're not hearing Paul's skew. We're not hearing Ringo's POV. We're not hearing Yoko's skew. Everybody's got a skew. Everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's got like a bend on history that leans toward them. We talk about this with the Misfits all the time. You see it with Jerry Only. You see it with Glenn Danzig. Everybody has a bend on history. That's why this is so cool to see. I can almost make my own appraisal based on what I'm seeing and based on what I've read around the situation. So in any case, they go there, and that's where we leave off. That's part 1 of this. I'm going to do part 2, and I'm going to do part 3, and then, depending on whether I can get my guest or not, I may do an overall sort of, post-mortem with a guest who is remarkably highly regarded in the Beatle world. I'd love to have him on my show. So we'll see if we can get him for that. But in the meantime, we're going to do part 2, and then we're going to do part 3. So that's where we leave off. We leave off with George quitting the band. And as we said, the Beatles all took turns quitting the band. First, Ringo quit the band during the White Album. Then George quit the band during Let It Be. Then John quit the band right after Abbey Road. And then Paul finally quits the band, officially quits the band, I should say, during the release of Let It Be. So actually, to correct myself, it is George who quits during Get Back. Paul quits during Let It Be 1 year later, because Get Back is different from Let It Be, right? The big question is, did Danzig watch Get Back? Minister of Darkness, you said that the fight never happened. I want more of an explanation. Your what you said doesn't pan out for me. You need to get more specific. I want to know more. Where did you hear that debunked? That is not debunked. That's what happened. Why doesn't Jackson talk more about why George left? Maybe they'll talk about it in part 2. The animosity between George and Yoko was insane. George was nasty to Yoko too. Make no mistake. Thank you for watching this with me. I wasn't intending this to be almost 2 hours, but it's the Beatles. What can I do? I want to talk for a moment about my sponsor, riotstickers.com. Are you in a band? Are you guys in a band? Who is in a band? Who is a filmmaker? Who is an artist of some kind who needs stickers? Well, I'm here to tell you that riotstickers.com is a great way to get your stickers pressed up. They are the official sponsor of the From Us channel now. I am powered by riotstickers.com, as you can see right here, and we are running a special promo deal, and I guarantee you will not find some other leading sticker brands that I won't name because I don't want to be mean, but let's just say their stickers don't stick very well. Don't offer a deal, or their deal pales in comparison to this deal, okay? And basically, it works like this. You can get 50 3x3 stickers. So that's 3-inch by 3-inch vinyl stickers, 50 of them. When you use the promo code FROMUS, and you will get $50% off those stickers. So what the total cost for you would actually be $29.50. So for $29.50, you can get 50 3x3 square stickers, or you can get 50 3x3 die cut stickers. That's where it has like a particular shape. Okay? Minister of Darkness, if you need stickers, please check out. The link is in the description, everybody. Go check it out. You go to riotstickers.com to that link and you use the promo code FROMUS and you're going to get 50% off. You're not going to find a better deal. You're not going to find a better deal than that. It's not actually $59. It's 50% off. I'm going to fix that. I need to fix that. That doesn't make sense. It's, but you get 50 stickers for 50% off when you use my promo code. And that, like I said, do you know how big a 3x3 sticker is? That is a nice piece of real estate. It's very visual. You know, it's very visual. So if you have a band, right, and you're trying to get your brand or your brand seen, you need to have it big enough to be seen. You can't have these tiny little stickers. You need big stickers. So I got to tell you, and I've ordered, you know, I'm not just playing them up because they're my sponsor. I have done business in the past with riotstickers.com, run by this guy, Joshua Grove. Great guy, independent business. They do stickers for a lot of people. I know Robbie Bloodshed has done business with them. I know Joe from Mr. Monster and Darrow Chemical Company. He's done business with riotstickers.com. Both those guys will swear by riotstickers.com in addition to me swearing by riotstickers.com. So go check that out. Promo code FROMUS for 50% off of $59. So it's you getting 50% off $59. So that comes out to $29.50 or $34.50 if you do the die cut. Okay. I'm a big fan. I am a big fan of riotstickers.com, and I don't mind championing something that I feel really good about. And now we're going to play the video. That's right. There's a video. There is a really cool video. Check out this video all about riotstickers.com.
We make stickers, banners, and buttons too. Posters and promo cards. There's nothing we can't print for you. From stage backdrops to bass drum heads. We can print on shirts. We can print on hats. We can print on pants. Cheap prices and high quality. Quick turnaround times and free shipping. We also offer free artwork support. Great customer service and so much more. Riotstickers.com. Riot Stickers, we are the bomb. Riotstickers.com. Riot Stickers, we are the bomb. Riotstickers.com. Riot Stickers, we are the bomb. Riotstickers.com. Riot Stickers, we are the bomb.
So, I mean, there you go, guys. I mean, what a cool theme song that is. So check out. All that stuff is in the description below. Go visit riotstickers.com. Use the promo code FROMUS. The link to get to that special deal is in the description below. And we'll see you again very soon. As soon as I watch that second part, we're going to do the second part of this. I'm going to play us out with the Patreon classic. So peace and hair grease, and we'll see you next time.
Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jeff. So I've decided to make a Patreon. What is Patreon? I don't know how to define a Patreon. Let me look it up. Patreon is a membership platform that makes it very easy for creators to get paid for the things that they're already creating. I want to do it full time. I want this to be my full-time job. In my efforts to make that happen, I've set up this platform. Is it going to work? Is it going to be successful? I don't know, but I would rather try and crash and burn than not try at all. The goal is to create enough passive revenue so that I can continue to do this full-time, uninterrupted. Why? Because I love to do this. I love creating content. I love making videos. I love shooting films. I love doing podcasts. In case you couldn't tell, I love to talk and I never shut the fuck up. So right now I've kept the Patreon incredibly simple. There's 2 tiers, and that may change in the future. The Murdergram is a simple way to extend support for all of the hours and hours of free content on the channel for nothing more than $1. 38 cents goes to Patreon. What's $1.38, eh? It's less than a cup of coffee, but it's a great way that you can show support for very little effort. When you divide that $1.38 by the hours and hours and hours of time spent listening to this endless drivel of content, the dollar cost average works out. Next up is the YouTube casualty for $6.66. The YouTube casualty is loaded to the gills. Enjoy the archive ad-free, as well as ad-free early access to special docu-style podcast videos, music reaction commentaries, and the like, a month before they drop on YouTube, loaded with ads, I might add. You're also going to get exclusive content and behind-the-scenes content that is not available on YouTube or anywhere else. So you get to peek behind the veil. And believe me, there's a couple of choice pieces. Most of all, more than anything, whether you join the Patreon or not, I just want to thank each and every one of you that comes to the channel, that watches all the shows, that leaves comments, that participates, that subscribes. That's really the most important thing. This is just trying to find a way to earn a living as an artist. And with that, thank you for my TED Talk. Join the Patreon, because we need you!
66 cents.